Hello and welcome to this edition of AI Insights. And we talk about how AI becomes real in enterprises. And with me today, I have someone who's actually one of the top people who can probably talk about it, which is Himanshu Arora, who is the Chief Digital Analytics Officer at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. Himanshu, welcome.
Thank you, Amaresh. Good to be here.
Likewise, always fun to chat with you. Himanshu, I know, there's a lot of obviously hype as well as kind of a bunch of reality, but there's a lot of talk and not a whole lot of it is done in this AI space in enterprises, at least how when I see it. And you are kind of an exception. You are in a very steady way. You are kind of leading the organization in the journey, step by step, and making progress. So tell me a little bit, where are you in this AI journey, and where is the organization AI journey, and kind of how did it start?
Yeah, there's a bit of a joke around this when I'm asked that question, where you're in the journey. It's like we're on the crawl, walk, run spectrum,
Yes.
and we have graduated from crawl, but now we are bumping into stuff, right? Like if you imagine a little child or a toddler starting to do that, and what that boils down into sort of a construct for us is, if we break AI into sort of two distinct pieces, correlated, linked but distinct pieces, there's been the machine learning based journey, which for the better part of the last 5 years has been a primary focus area. Right. So when we look at those pieces, we have assets, algorithms, models that are up and running, generating clear business outcomes today, whether it's in the space of applying it for member experience and journeys, detecting and reducing fraud, waste, and abuse, whether it's in the area of identifying new care pathways for members. So machine learning based AI, when we look at that in the crawl, walk, run spectrum, we are somewhere between the walk and run, right? So there's still a lot more to do there, but the patterns there are clearer in terms of where we are applying them and how we are evaluating them for ultimately economic outcomes, business outcomes, experience outcomes for us, for our members, for other constituents. The newer part of the journey, quite frankly, at least recently, more exciting part of the journey is through the generative AI work, which is the distinction here is that if I look back at the machine learning AI, that was a lot of capabilities that from a center of excellence perspective, we were bringing to our business teams. Generative AI, there's been an equal enthusiasm alongside the build, whether you call it driven by hype or visibility, ChatGPT getting to like 100 million users in a very short duration of time, right? Captivating the imagination. That's been a pretty transformative step, both from the perspective of bringing visibility to it, and therefore the ask for, well, can I use this? How can I use this? But also creating some alignment, natural alignment between different parts of the organization towards, here's what we must achieve to be differentiated versus here are things we must focus on so that we can at least be at parity, right? So sort of this concept of everyday AI versus game-changing AI. And so in that part of the journey, like I said, we think we have progressed from the crawl pieces so that we have better understanding of where should we expect to see outcomes first, and those are the use cases we are prioritizing, and I'm happy to talk through those.
Sure.
But quite frankly, from a infrastructure perspective, how to run and operate these things at scale efficiently, what are the underlying cost models, how do you then turn this into a firm ROI, what can you take to the bank versus not, those are things that are still
working through,
still being worked through.
Wonderful. You used the term everyday AI versus game-changing AI. I think I know what you're saying, but can you throw some light into it. Tell me a little bit what's your definition about it.
Yeah, so essentially it's a concept borrowed from Gartner, and essentially what it talks about is, or is meant to focus on is, when we think about AI and generative AI, our minds typically go to those capabilities which are going to be breakthroughs and transformative capabilities, especially as you apply it to healthcare, right? So think about the big outcomes and advances that we are all expecting, anticipating in terms of care delivery, care outcomes, how new treatments are devised, identified, how this is applied, even to, I was reading how Moderna is doing,
Yes.
has created 400 plus agents to accelerate drug discovery, right? So that's the breakthrough stuff, right? But if you look at it in terms of the number of areas that you can apply to a organization, to a function like ours, there's a lot more below the surface of the waterline, if you will, right? So these are the areas where it is really about how do you create efficiencies? How do you create sort of you can look at it as the incremental benefit, but still a defined benefit that is previously not possible. Examples of this are in any organization that is end consumer facing, which we certainly are. There is a lot of interaction and engagement between us and our members. And a lot of these interaction points are often about looking to solve for an adverse outcome, right? So members calling us because they don't have their ID card. They went for a pharmacy refill and there was an issue there, or they see a claim that they expected to be paid in full was not, or partial, there's some concern there. And therefore there's a reliance on a standard process, but each of these cases ends up being some version of a snowflake. And so what we end up doing on our side is applying human capital to solve for challenges because we want to deliver the best consumer experience, etc. But now with generative AI, whether it's in this case, it's in care management, it's even in sales and marketing, you can take a lot of that repetitive work or work that requires aligning different input points, knowledge points from different places, assimilating it into a whole, and turning it into a succinct, clear, accessible solution for the member, right? That's the everyday AI, right? So we are all going to, I anticipate, feel the benefits of generative AI in small ways a large number of times, and in large ways a few instances or number of times. And that's really the framework.
That's a very good framework to think about it. You and I have chatted before, and there's some, I think, very interesting kind of best practices that you're kind of following, or you're creating best practices, I would say, in this journey through bumping around and kind of learning, as you just said. There are two that absolutely stand out. I want to kind of, want you to throw some light on this. One is obviously how you have used these AI vision days. So if you can talk a little bit about it, then I think your use of the entire ecosystem, AI ecosystem. So can you talk a little bit about like the vision days and kind of how it works and kind of what's been the feedback, and just throw a little more light so that people learn from
your experience. Yeah, happy to. So vision days have been very well received for us as an organization. And I think for two main reasons. Right? So number one, let's step back. What we're doing in the vision days is we are bringing our business counterparts, people on our teams or associates, to an idea of how, this is the underlying capability. These are some example areas of how we think it can be applied, but then really using the time to co-create and generate ideas and idea boards around what are the big picture solutions that we're looking for. And by design, at the top of these sessions or in the front of these sessions, we're taking a very unconstrained view, right? To say, let's put aside technology constraint, cost constraints, resource constraints, any of those other constraints. What does the ultimate outcome in the space look like? And we recently went through these exercises with our internal clinical teams and our internal Medicare sales teams, again, to say, what does the big picture ideal state solution look like for your teams when it comes to the intersection of work, units of work that are a combination of knowledge and uh, workflows and some element of repetition in there, right? So there is a pattern that we can look to unlock from. And then you use those, we've been using those days to then say, okay, this is the broader plate. You try and identify the areas which are going to have the highest impact, but then also areas that are the most feasible, right? Because that intersection then gives you the area to say, okay, this eventually we will get to all of these, but where do we start from? And so that, and by the way, I talked about earlier how Gen AI has been the fastest spreading innovation in our, at least in our lifetimes. And so everybody is aware. People have used chat GPTs, etc., in some way, shape, or form, and have had some direct or even indirect exposure, both to the good and the concerning parts that we've all heard about. So people are coming into these sessions with at least a sense, if not a fully preconceived notion of what to expect. And so then the idea is, okay, where is this going to be applicable, most impactful, highest feasibility, and how are we going to apply them within our organization? And really, it becomes a co-product.
Yes.
Where a center of excellence like ours is working with the business teams to create the energy. And quite frankly, we're not relying on the idea of build it and they will come. We are co-building it. So quote unquote, the customers, internal customers, consumers of it are clear. This is also, by the way, our way of feeding into generative AI at scale, which is eventually external member facing. We're not quite ready for that.
Right.
But this is the human in the loop idea, which is to say, okay, let's focus on our associates so that we can enable them so that they can drive better outcomes. And that also becomes a funnel of validation for, are these experiences, generative AI driven experiences, workflows, processes, are they, or when will they be ready for direct consumption by the end consumer? And so that gives us a good frame to work with. And so, quite frankly, these have been so successful that now we have a bigger backlog, which is a good thing of how to do more of these. And so now what we're balancing is making promises and delivering on promises, if you will. And so that's the balance.
And so in some ways, what's really interesting is it's not about you pushing the idea. You are in some ways, what the way you described it, harnessing the ideas that already exist from the business, and you are probably giving it a structure and approach to do it in a kind of delivered in a structured way, which I think kind of is probably different than some of the other models that at least in the whole old ML world, in some ways, they're very hard to prove why this thing works. I don't think I have to prove proving that as much.
Yeah, English is a beautiful programming language. So
that's true. That's true. AI ecosystems. I know there's a whole and partner ecosystems that is there. How have you thought about the AI ecosystem around talent and AI ecosystem? And any ideas around that folks can learn from who are listening to this?
Yeah, I think so. By the way, we went through a AI ecosystem thinking evaluation process, even in the early parts of the ML journey. And in some ways, the thinking is similar. In some ways, it's different. I'll describe both. Where it's similar is this idea of, look, we have a core set of platforms, tools, technologies, human capital, both the build and the consume teams on our sides, right? How do we scale and leverage that? But there's also that what's different is there's this recognition of this is the fastest changing space ever. So our goal has been to, in working with OXO and others, to bring that change that is happening in an accelerated way to the core that we have so that we can spin things out fast. And by the way, this also gives us the opportunity to establish some patterns, but then adapt around those patterns in a much more in a much more responsive way, right? So we're not taking months to come up with the next iteration, where it's days to low number of weeks where we can turn things around. And quite frankly, that's the expectation as well, right? Which is if we are looking at whether it's competitors or others, even outside of the industry, able to adopt these things at a much faster pace, a
Right.
reasonable expectation is we should be able to do that. And so the ecosystem then becomes a conjoin of what we have and what we've built and scaled on, and we have good confidence in, and other innovative capabilities where, again, there is figuring things out. It's not a neat fit, right? It's not puzzle pieces that go right in. Uh, there's some shaping around the edges that needs to happen. But that's proven to be the best model for us
Interesting.
so far.
So the two things I kind of took away from it, one is this you just are going in with an assumption that there'll be a lot more research and not everything is figured out. Uh,
Oh,
and
yeah.
and secondly is kind of just the frequency of kind of how fast you are working, knowing that there are a few things that will fail. I think that, so those are the kind of the two things about kind of that I kind of stood out. So that's wonderful as you think about the
Yeah.
ecosystem play.
Rent where we can.
Yeah. Uh, One thing, just one or two things which are, I mean, in your game-changing ideas or kind of everyday ideas, like one or two things that you're working on that that you feel is going to add a ton of impact for the organization.
Yeah. And so on the everyday ideas side, right? And by the way, these everyday ideas then become the foundation on which you launch game-changing ideas.
Right.
So, we're focused right now more on the everyday ideas is, like I mentioned, there's a lot of knowledge capital work, knowledge-driven work with repetitive workflows, but the recipient or the beneficiary is each member, therefore they're unique. And in the care management space or in the benefits management space, benefit inquiry space, that's an area where we are applying this capability to. Because the idea here is how do we how do we take a knowledge worker today, which is one of our, let's say, our clinical team members, who's reaching out to members, give them the pathway to be much more efficient and much more comprehensive in the view that they have of the individual going into a engagement conversation, so that they can have a very focused but also very rich discussion with the member,
Mhm.
as opposed to most of their time going into figuring out what they need to talk about, or sometimes finding things out on the fly, right? So preparedness is one part of it. Then on the other side, follow through, follow up, synthesis, what are the next steps? That's an area. And the goal here is how do we take each one of our knowledge workers in the space who are highly trained, highly proficient, want to serve even more members and allow them the opportunity to do that. So if we can take a 45-minute end-to-end effort on an item and reduce it down to 10, even 15 minutes, we're setting ourselves up to be able to serve now thrice as many members
Right.
as we were previously able to, with still the same human capacity, but it's an augmentation model, right? And this theme then applies to our sales teams, internal Medicare sales teams, and other areas as well. There's a lot of thinking that has gone into, but nothing quite ready for prime time, if you will, on the game changing areas. And quite frankly, that's where uh, I expect the next big wave of our competitive advantage is going to come from. So I'm going to hold that a little bit close to the
Sure.
chest, if you will.
Sure.
But hopefully in one of these next sessions we can talk about that too.
Absolutely. No, Himanshu, I mean, as I said, I mean, it's really fun to hear and very interesting to hear about people who have been doing and learning and kind of bumping along and learnings. One last question. Any big one piece of advice you would have for some of your peers who are going through that journey?
This is a piece of advice I also received, so I'm happy to pass it forward, which is, if I reflect back, this time last year, it felt that it was a daunting space to start to get into,
Mm.
even because of the underlying, or at least the perception of the underlying technical complexity, the need for GPUs. Do I have to train my own model? What happens with my data? Am I going to start hemorrhaging data all over the place, right? And what eventually I got guided towards was start small, start with an augmentation model, and start with our own internal teams to begin with. So and again, there may be more degrees of freedom, if you will, in another sector or industry. We tend to be, for good reasons, a little bit more conservative in healthcare. But that model has worked out well. That delivers outcomes, builds credibility, and then we can take bigger moonshots from there.
Perfect. As usual, Himanshu, you've always very interesting tidbits and insights. So thank you always to kind of come over and share. We'll obviously continue chatting.
Yes, Amaresh, thank you, and talk soon.
OXO AI. What if? What's next?